All right, let's dive into a story that's become kind of like a fairy tale, but way more complicated.
Yeah, for sure.
Juan Ponce de León, the guy everyone thinks of when they hear Fountain of Youth.
Right.
But I gotta say, there's way more to this guy than just that legendary search.
Absolutely. A lot more.
We're gonna try to uncover the real story here,
Definitely.
using some historical accounts we've dug up, so get ready for some twists and turns.
It's interesting how Ponce de León is just automatically linked to this idea of eternal youth.
Right.
But the real story, it's much more interesting than that.
I'm ready. Let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Ponce de León, born back in 1460, comes from a small village in Spain,
Right.
Santa Vasta Campos.
Yeah.
Not exactly a huge city, right?
No.
What was life like there back then?
Well, Santa Vasta Gambos is in the Castilla y León region,
Okay.
a place with a ton of history, medieval history.
Right.
It was rural, but this whole region, it was super important for Spain's maritime ambitions.
Ah,
So Ponce de León, he was practically born into this age of exploration.
I see.
Imagine like growing up hearing those stories about voyages and new lands.
Yeah, like destiny was calling him to explore. But he didn't stay in Spain.
Yep.
He ended up sailing to the Caribbean,
He did.
landed in Boracay.
Yeah.
We know it as Puerto Rico today.
Right.
So what was behind that move back in 1508?
Well, he had heard all these tales of riches, and he was an ambitious guy.
Yeah,
Ponce de León wasn't just going sightseeing, he was there to stake a claim for Spain.
right.
Had the backing of the Spanish crown to establish a presence in this new territory.
Okay.
He had a real conquistador mindset.
So it was more about conquering than just discovering then.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And that meant encountering the people already living there, the native Taíno people.
Exactly.
What was that first encounter like?
Well, it's a tragic story of how things went wrong.
Okay.
The Taíno, they were known for being welcoming. Initially, they welcomed the Spanish, but that welcome was betrayed when the Spanish showed their true intention.
Yeah.
They were there to dominate, not to cooperate.
The dark side of exploration, once again,
Sadly.
we're talking exploitation, enslavement, brutality,
Yes.
all inflicted on the Taíno under Ponce de León's rule,
It's a stark reminder of the true cost of colonization.
for sure.
A crucial part of the story, but a very sad one.
Yep.
The Taíno population, there were over 30,000 of them, and they were decimated
Wow.
by a bunch of factors: conflict with the Spanish, European diseases, and forced labor.
A tragic chapter.
Yes, one we can't ignore.
Absolutely not. And to be clear, Ponce de León, with his soldiers, colonists, and slaves, he wasn't just passively exploring. We're talking about 50 soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
He was actively trying to establish control for Spain, exploiting the island,
That's right.
even the gold mines.
Absolutely. He was putting a system in place designed to take wealth and subjugate the native people. And the encomienda system was key to this.
Right.
Basically, it gave Spanish colonists the right to force the Taíno into labor
Oh, wow.
in exchange for protection and supposedly converting to Christianity.
Right, right.
But in reality, it was just brutal exploitation that made the Spanish rich at the expense of the Taíno.
Yeah. It's a far cry from the image we often see, the valiant explorer.
It is.
Raises a lot of questions about how we should view these figures.
It does.
How do we balance their achievements with their actions?
That's the question, isn't it?
It's a tough one.
Yeah. It really is a question we need to ask ourselves when we look at history.
Yeah,
How do we acknowledge both the good and the bad?
right.
It's not about erasing history, but understanding it.
Okay, so we've established that Puerto Rico wasn't exactly a peaceful paradise under Ponce de León.
No.
But he doesn't stop there.
Nope.
His story continues.
It does.
He sets his sights on Florida,
Yeah.
a land full of mystery.
It was.
So what year are we talking about here, and what made him interested in Florida?
This is 1513, just a few years after he conquered Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Ponce de León leads 3 ships north.
Okay.
And this is where the Fountain of Youth story really starts to take hold.
Right.
The popular story is that Ponce de León was looking for this magical spring that could make you young again.
Right, right.
But was he really?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
Was he really after a magical fountain, or was there more to it?
Yeah.
Was it ambition? Was it expanding Spain's territory?
Well, the Fountain of Youth was a popular story in Europe at the time,
Okay.
but there's no real proof that it was Ponce de León's main goal.
Really?
That connection probably came later,
Oh, okay.
maybe from stories that romanticized his journey.
I see.
It's a reminder that history is often rewritten to sound better.
Yeah. That makes sense. So if it wasn't a magical fountain, what was so special about Florida?
Well, Ponce de León really seemed to believe that Florida was an island.
An island.
Yeah, not a peninsula connected to the mainland.
Huh.
Might seem strange to us now, but remember, back then, Europeans didn't know much about the Americas.
That's true.
Maps weren't accurate, and there were all these wild stories going around.
Right.
So it's a mix of ambition, exploration, and maybe even some wrong geography.
Interesting.
It shows how complex these historical events really were.
Yeah.
Ponce de León was a man of his time, driven by wealth, glory, and expanding the Spanish Empire.
Okay.
But he also genuinely wanted to explore.
Right.
He believed in the possibilities of the unknown.
What about those possibilities then? What did he find when he got to Florida? Did it live up to his expectations?
Well, if he was looking for a magical fountain, he was in for a surprise.
Okay.
He landed in Florida on April 2, 1513.
Okay.
That date's pretty important in Florida's history.
Right.
But what he found wasn't an empty beach.
Yeah, I bet it wasn't that simple.
No.
Who was already living in Florida when he got there?
Florida was home to a lot of different indigenous tribes.
Each with their own cultures and languages and ways of life.
Yeah.
And one of the most powerful groups he met were the Calusa people.
I've heard about them. They weren't exactly happy to see Spanish ships on their shores.
No, they weren't.
What made them such tough opponents?
The Calusa were unique.
Okay.
Their territory covered a huge area of what's now southwestern Florida.
Oh, wow.
And they had a really complex society.
Really?
They weren't just hunter-gatherers.
Okay.
They had a social structure, they were great at fishing, and they were strong militarily.
So the Fountain of Youth might have been a myth, but the danger was very real.
Very real.
Sounds like you walked into a hornet's nest.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So what happened next?
The Calusa were skilled warriors, they were great in their canoes, and they used poison arrows.
We got to talk about those poison arrows.
We do.
I heard they played a part in Ponce de León's fate.
He did. And this is where the story gets interesting.
During a fight with the Calusa, Ponce de León himself was hit by one of their arrows. A poisoned arrow. It's almost ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
The man who brought so much pain to the native people was brought down by their weapon.
History has a way of doing that, evening the score.
It does.
So did Ponce de León die right there on the battlefield?
The wound was fatal, but it took some time.
Okay.
He was taken back to Cuba and died in Havana.
Not exactly a glorious end for a conqueror.
No.
So Ponce de León dies in 1521, never finding the Fountain of Youth.
That's right.
He never managed to establish a Spanish colony in Florida either.
No.
What a story. It's full of ambition, violence, and, in the end, failure.
It is.
But his story doesn't end there, does it?
No, it doesn't.
His name lives on.
It does.
In the history books and the myth of the Fountain of Youth.
Exactly. He might not have achieved immortality literally, but his name is tied to that quest forever.
That's interesting.
It's amazing how this myth has grown and shaped how we see him, even after all this time.
It is. It makes you wonder, how should we view Juan Ponce de León today? He was a product of his time.
Absolutely.
Driven by the ambitions and prejudices of 16th century Spain.
Right.
But his actions changed the course of history.
They did.
In the Caribbean and in Florida.
Yeah.
So how do we balance the explorer with the conqueror?
It's complicated. There's no easy answer.
Right.
On one hand, he was a skilled navigator and explorer.
Yeah.
He played a big role in expanding the Spanish Empire.
Okay.
His voyages opened up new frontiers and helped Europeans learn about the Americas.
But we can't ignore the bad stuff either.
No, we can't.
The Taíno people being wiped out in Puerto Rico.
Right.
The clashes with the Calusa in Florida.
Yeah.
The forced labor.
Yeah.
The diseases.
That's all part of his legacy.
All part of his legacy.
Yeah. It's like trying to see two opposite things at the same time.
Oh?
The brave explorer venturing into new lands, and the ruthless conqueror forcing his will on the native people.
That's a theme throughout the history of exploration and colonization, isn't it?
It is.
A tension that we need to understand.
Yeah. He's also just label people as heroes or villains. It's more complicated than that.
So how do we balance those two sides of Ponce de León?
I think we need to avoid simple stories and accept the complexity.
Okay.
Ponce de León was a complicated man, driven by ambition, curiosity, and the belief that Spanish culture was superior.
Right.
He was shaped by his time, but he also shaped it.
I see.
His story reminds us that history is rarely black and white.
Right.
It's full of shades of gray, and what we think we know about the past is always changing as we learn more.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Exactly.
And in Ponce de Leon's case, it's fascinating and challenging.
It is, and as we learn more about him, we realize his story isn't just about him.
Okay.
It's about the indigenous people he encountered, the clash of cultures, and the lasting effects of colonialism.
So we've gone beyond the simple myth of the Fountain of Youth.
Yes.
We've found a much richer story.
Absolutely.
But there's one more thing I'm curious about. That myth itself.
Okay.
Why has it lasted for so long?
That's a great question. And it takes us beyond the facts and into human psychology and mythology.
Yeah.
The Fountain of Youth represents something deep within us.
Yeah.
A longing for something that might not even exist.
I think you're right. It's a powerful symbol that goes beyond time and culture.
It does.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We need to take a break and gather our thoughts.
Sounds good. Welcome back. So we were talking about Ponce de Leon's arrival in Florida.
Right.
And those powerful indigenous tribes he met there.
Yeah, especially the Calusa people.
Exactly. I'm really curious to hear what happened when Ponce de Leon, with his plans for conquest, came face to face with the Calusa, who were determined to protect their land.
Yeah, good question. Did he manage to accomplish anything he set out to do in Florida? Or did the Calusa stop him?
Well, he definitely didn't find the Fountain of Youth, that's for sure.
Okay, so that was never a real thing.
But if his goals were to explore, claim land for Spain, and maybe find some gold,
Right.
then yeah, you could say his expedition was partly successful.
Okay.
But it wasn't easy, and there
Well,
were some serious consequences.
I see. So he didn't just leave after that first encounter with the Calusa.
Oh no. Ponce de Leon wasn't the type to give up easily.
Okay.
He went back to Florida in 1521,
Oh, wow.
this time with a much bigger expedition.
Okay.
He was determined to create a permanent Spanish settlement.
Ah, so he was serious about this.
Yeah, brought colonists, livestock, everything you'd need to start a colony.
I'll bet the Calusa weren't too thrilled about that.
They weren't. The Calusa, led by a chief of the Spanish called Carlos,
Okay.
they fought back hard.
Rightfully so.
They saw the Spanish as invaders,
Yeah.
a direct threat to their whole way of life.
Makes sense.
And they were ready to do whatever it took to protect their territory.
Wow, this must have been a pretty intense time for Florida.
It was.
What do we know about those battles between Ponce de Leon and the Calusa? Were they just small skirmishes, or were there bigger, organized battles?
Unfortunately, there aren't many detailed accounts of those fights.
Oh, too bad.
But what we do know shows a really strong and persistent resistance.
Okay.
The Calusa knew the terrain really well, and they were masters of fighting on the water.
Right. They had the home field advantage.
Exactly. And they made things really difficult for the Spanish.
So they didn't just stay on the defensive.
No.
They actually took the fight to Ponce de Leon's forces.
Exactly. They used hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and of course those poisoned arrows.
Yeah, you mentioned those before.
They knew the land, they knew the waterways, and they used it all to their advantage.
Smart.
Very smart.
And those poisoned arrows were ultimately what led to Ponce de Leon's downfall, right?
This is where the story takes a bit of a turn. During one of those fights with the Calusa, Ponce de Leon was hit with a poisoned arrow.
No way.
Yeah. It seems almost poetic, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
The man who caused so much pain and suffering
Right.
ends up being brought down by the weapon used by the people he was trying to conquer.
It's like history has a sense of justice, even if it takes a while.
It does seem that way sometimes.
So Ponce de Leon's ambition literally backfired on him. Did he die right there in the battle?
The wound was fatal, but he didn't die right away.
Okay.
He was taken back to Cuba,
Okay.
and he died shortly after that, in Havana.
Not the ending you'd expect for a conqueror, huh?
Not exactly. So Ponce de Leon dies in 1521, never finding that Fountain of Youth,
Right.
and he never managed to establish that Spanish colony in Florida.
What a wild story. Ambition, violence, and in the end, failure.
It is.
But it feels like his story continues even after his death.
It does.
His name is still out there
Yes.
in the history books and connected to that myth of the Fountain of Youth.
Exactly. He may not have lived forever, but his name is tied to that idea.
It's crazy how that myth has stuck around
Yeah.
and shaped how people see him, even centuries later.
It is fascinating. So, how do we view Juan Ponce de Leon today? He was a man of his time, of course.
Right. Shaped by those ambitions and prejudices of 16th century Spain.
Yes.
But his actions had a huge impact
They did.
in the Caribbean and in Florida.
Definitely. So how do we reconcile those two sides of him, the explorer and the conqueror?
It's a tough question.
It is. There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
On the one hand, he was a talented navigator and explorer.
Yeah.
He was crucial in expanding the Spanish Empire.
Okay.
His voyages opened up new parts of the world
Right.
and helped Europeans learn about the Americas.
But we can't forget the negative side either.
We can't.
The destruction of the Taíno people in Puerto Rico,
Right.
the conflicts with the Calusa in Florida,
Yes.
the forced labor, the diseases.
It's all part of his story. We can't separate those things.
It's like we're trying to hold two completely opposite ideas in our minds at the same time.
Yes.
The image of the daring explorer going into unknown territory,
Yes.
and then the image of the brutal conqueror who forces his will onto native populations. That's something that runs through so much of the history of exploration and colonization.
Absolutely. A real tension that we have to understand.
Yeah. We can't just say someone was a hero or a villain.
No, it's much more complicated than that.
So how do we balance those two sides of Ponce de León?
I think we have to avoid making things too simple and embrace the complexity.
Oh, okay.
Ponce de León was a complex person,
Right.
driven by ambition, by curiosity, and by the belief that Spanish culture was superior.
I see.
He was influenced by his time, but he also helped shape it.
Interesting.
His story shows us that history is rarely black and white.
Yeah.
It's full of gray areas, and what we think we know about the past is always changing as we learn more.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. And with Ponce de León, those layers are both fascinating and difficult to confront.
They are. As we learn more about him, we realize his story is bigger than just him.
Okay. How so?
It's also about the indigenous people he interacted with, the clashes between cultures, and the lasting effects of colonialism.
So we've gone deeper than just the myth of the Fountain of Youth
We have.
and discovered a much richer story.
We have. But there's still that one part I'm curious about.
What's that?
The myth itself. Why has it lasted for so long?
That's a really good question.
It goes beyond just historical facts.
Okay.
It gets into human psychology and the stories we tell ourselves.
Right.
The Fountain of Youth represents something we all seem to want.
What's that?
The desire to escape aging and death.
Yeah, I get it.
It's a powerful symbol that shows up across different cultures and throughout history.
It's like we all wish we could hit a reset button
Exactly.
and go back to being young and full of energy.
Right. And Ponce de León has become the symbol of that quest, even if it wasn't his main goal.
That's fascinating.
What's even more interesting is how this myth has actually affected the real world.
Okay, how so?
Like, in St. Augustine, Florida, there's a place called the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park.
Wait, are you serious? People can actually visit the supposed Fountain of Youth.
Yeah.
Is there any historical evidence to support that location?
Well, it's more about the legend than about historical facts.
Okay.
But it shows how the story of Ponce de León and that fountain still holds our attention.
That's wild.
It shows the power of myths,
Yeah,
how they can blur the lines between what's real and what's made up,
right.
and how they can shape how we see the past and even influence our present.
It makes you think about how we tell the difference between fact and fiction,
It does.
especially with these historical figures who have become almost legendary.
Exactly. So we have Ponce de León, the explorer, the conqueror, and kind of accidentally the Fountain of Youth seeker.
Yeah. So knowing all of this, how should we remember him?
I think the best way to remember him is as a complicated person. Okay. He was shaped by his time, driven by ambition, curiosity, and the idea that Spanish culture was better than others.
Nice.
He was both a part of and a shaper of the forces that created early colonial history.
So not a hero, not a villain, just a man caught up in the events of his time.
Exactly. He both reflected and contributed to the complexities of that era.
His story really reminds us that we have to look at history carefully.
It does.
We need to question the stories we've been told
Yes.
and really try to understand the past in a deeper, more nuanced way.
That's the goal.
Okay, so we're back and ready to kind of wrap things up with Juan Ponce de León.
Sounds good.
We've gone from his early days in Spain through his conquests in Puerto Rico, all the way to those clashes with the Calusa people in Florida.
It's quite a journey.
It is, and we've seen how his story connects to those bigger themes,
Yeah.
exploration, colonization,
Yeah,
that clash of cultures that really shaped the Americas.
absolutely. But there's one more thing we need to discuss.
Right, that whole Fountain of Youth myth.
Exactly.
It's practically attached to his name,
It is.
even though, historically, it doesn't really hold up.
Right.
Why do you think that association has lasted so long?
Hmm. That's a question that goes beyond just the historical facts.
Okay.
The Fountain of Youth myth, it speaks to something we all seem to want,
What's that?
that desire to escape aging, to escape death.
Yeah, I get that.
It's a powerful symbol. It
Yeah.
crosses cultures, it shows up throughout history.
It's like we all wish we could hit a reset button,
Exactly.
go back to being young and full of energy.
Right? And somehow, Ponce de Leon became the symbol of that quest.
Even though it wasn't really his main goal?
Yeah. And it's fascinating how this myth has, actually affected the real world.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, for example, there's a place in St. Augustine, Florida.
Okay.
It's called the Fountain of Youth Archaeological Park.
Wait, you're serious? People could actually visit the
Yeah.
supposed Fountain of Youth?
Yeah, it's a thing.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Is there any real evidence that it's the actual location?
It's more about the legend, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
But it just shows how the story of Ponce de Leon and that fountain, they still capture our imagination.
Yeah. Even after all these centuries.
Exactly. It shows you the power of myths.
Right.
They can blur the lines between fact and fiction,
Yeah.
and they can shape how we understand the past and even influence us today.
It really makes you think about how we separate fact from fiction when we're looking at these historical figures who have become, almost larger than life.
It does.
So we have Ponce de Leon, the explorer, the conqueror, and, unintentionally, the Fountain of Youth seeker.
Yeah.
Knowing all of this, how should we remember him?
I think the most honest way to remember him is as a complex person.
Okay.
A product of his time, driven by those ambitions, that curiosity, and that belief that Spanish culture was superior.
Right.
He was both a part of and a shaper of the forces that were at play in early colonial history.
So not a hero, not a villain, but a man caught up in the events of his time.
Exactly. He both reflected and contributed to the complexities of his era.
It's a reminder to, approach history with a critical eye,
Yeah.
to question those narratives we've been told, and to try and understand the past in the deeper, more nuanced way.
Absolutely.
Well said. We've definitely uncovered a lot more than just that simple quest for a magical fountain.
We have.
We've explored a complex historical figure, the clash of cultures, the harsh realities of colonization, and the lasting power of myths.
And remember, history isn't just a list of names and dates.
Right.
It's like a tapestry with all these different threads, each telling its own story.
I like that.
The more we explore those threads, the richer our understanding becomes.
And the more we learn about ourselves in the process.
Exactly. So keep exploring, keep questioning, keep that thirst for knowledge alive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Juan Ponce de León. Until next time, happy exploring.